Hi there, this is Martin from LingoStar. In this video, I'm going to share with you my knowledge of dyslexia and also some practical techniques that you can use to better support English language learners who have dyslexia. I've also created a set of notes that go with this presentation as a supplement because this presentation is pretty short and I don't go into a lot of detail. You can access the notes by going to my website www.lingostar.net. So a really important place to start, I think, is to define dyslexia. And it's a really difficult concept to define because there are actually a lot of definitions out there. But perhaps the most useful definition comes from the Rose Report. In 2009, Jim Rose in the UK led an independent report and sent it to the Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Families. And it's become a very important document from which many recommendations have been made for the UK, but which are also relevant all over the world. So we know that dyslexia is a learning difficulty that mostly affects the ability to read fluently and also to spell. We also know that some characteristic features of dyslexia are difficulties in phonological awareness and also difficulties with verbal memory and verbal processing speed. We also know that dyslexia occurs across a range of intellectual abilities, and it's not a discrete condition. It's more like a continuum. There are no clear cutoff points. Dyslexia also very frequently co-occurs with other difficulties, and these might include things like motor coordination and mental calculation, concentration. And it also commonly occurs with other learning disabilities such as ADHD and ASD, to name just a few. But these additional difficulties or disabilities are not by themselves markers of dyslexia. So that's an important thing to keep in mind because it's hard to tease apart these different co-occurring difficulties. However, focusing on dyslexia, these are some of the things that might present. So as I mentioned before, dyslexia is a continuum going from mild to severe. We can get an indication of the severity by looking at how learners respond to some well-founded teaching intervention. Okay, so one of the most obvious signs that someone might be dyslexic is when they have particular difficulties with reading and spelling. Now, this is particularly problematic for English language learners because their first language might not be an alphabetic language. It might not have any similarities at all to English. And they're all at different stages of language acquisition. And so it's really important to take care when interpreting the observed difficulties with reading and spelling because, as you can see on this slide, the absence of reading difficulties doesn't preclude dyslexia. And also the presence of difficulties doesn't necessarily mean that the student has dyslexia. And so it's really important to just be aware of these and also to adjust our teaching so that regardless of whether the student has dyslexia or not, we can best support the learners in our group. Okay, so what are the characteristic features of dyslexia? This 3 levels framework comes from Frith, and Frith has devised a way of categorizing some of the features of dyslexia into biological, cognitive, and behavioral factors. Also, it's really important not to dismiss the environmental factors, which are relevant to all 3 of these. Now, each of the levels is interrelated with the others, and it's also really important to keep in mind that there's no clear distinction between causes and symptoms. These are factors, and of course there are overlaps between the different levels, and as we mentioned before, dyslexia is not a consistent kind of condition, so these signals might change over time or depending on the context in which they're observed. So clearly we can see here that there are biological factors. So we know that dyslexia is heritable and it's a neurobiological factor. We know that dyslexia is often correlated with a phonological deficit or a lack of phonological awareness, and I'll talk more about that later in this presentation. People with dyslexia often also have audio or visual deficits, and they may have a slower verbal processing speed and a lower capacity for verbal memory. As we mentioned before, people with dyslexia might display slower reading and writing and spelling skills and poorer decoding skills. They might have inconsistent spelling, which can be both phonetic and non-phonetic, and they tend to have a poor phonological awareness. All of these factors need to be considered within the broader context of the culture in which the learner is operating. Perhaps if the learner has a different cultural background, that should also be considered. And very importantly for us as teachers, what we do in the classroom will have a huge effect on all of these factors that we can see on the screen. All of these things will colour the different factors in this framework. So I mentioned before that intelligence is not an indicator of dyslexia, and it's not an indicator of how well a particular learner is going to respond to intervention. I've included a photo of Richard Branson on this slide because he is dyslexic, and in fact you might be surprised to learn that there are many successful, intelligent people who are dyslexic and who have been living with dyslexia. And so as teachers and educators, we really need to try not to see dyslexia as a disability, but as an area in which we can adjust our teaching practices to better support individual learners. So now I just want to quickly mention reasonable adjustment. Reasonable adjustment is an idea which is built into some of the important legislation in Australia, and it comes under, for instance, the Disability Standards for Education 2005 and also the Disability Discrimination Act 1992. And basically, reasonable adjustment is the idea that as an assessor, we need to allow learners to demonstrate their knowledge in alternative ways or make other adjustments to the assessment process which can help the learner, for example, giving someone with dyslexia more time to complete the task. Reasonable adjustment might also be a part of the legislation in your country if you're not in Australia, and it might have the same name or something quite similar. Social and emotional needs. Learners with dyslexia often have very low self-esteem or self-concept. And if you're wondering what self-concept means, take a learner's ideal imagined identity and subtract their level of self-esteem. What's left over is their self-concept. Now, the reason why learners with dyslexia tend to have low self-esteem and low self-concept is because they've been told all their lives that they are dumb or that they're incapable of doing things. And when this is repeated over and over again, it really does affect your sense of self-confidence, and it can also make learners feel really anxious, especially in formal education situations such as assessment situations. And this anxiety is even more pronounced in second language learners for whom English is an additional language. Fortunately, there are ways to increase confidence and to reduce anxiety in the classroom. According to some research done by Kormos, anxiety may not be correlated with specific learning disabilities in a classroom environment which is inclusive and is well planned and accommodating for the different learners. Kormos also notes that mindful practices in the classroom, like getting students to think positive thoughts before a quiz, can actually help to reduce anxiety and increase performance. In the classroom, we should also do our best to accommodate the diverse learners and to make appropriate adjustments to our teaching so that we are being inclusive. And not only are these practices good for learners with specific learning disabilities, such as dyslexia, but it's also generally best practice. The particular accommodations I'm going to mention here are approaches to reading, phonological awareness, and multisensory structured learning. Now, you're probably already familiar with bottom-up and top-down processing because that's an important area of second language acquisition, and as language teachers, we're using these techniques daily in our lessons. The bottom-up approach is a focus on orthography or the letters on the page, and we start with the letters or the sounds to determine what the word is. Top-down approaches are more context-driven, and an example of that would be guessing the meaning of an unfamiliar word by thinking about the co-text and the context. As language teachers, we also pay attention to pronunciation and phonology, and in fact, the research shows that explicit and systematic attention to phonics instruction helps to improve phonological awareness and helps to reduce the difficulties associated with dyslexia. Explicit phonics instruction means paying careful attention to sound and spelling relationships and getting students to practice blending, which is synthesizing different phonemes together, and segmenting words, which is the opposite process of breaking down a word into its constituent phonemes. It's really also important for students to understand that blending and segmentation are reverse processes. And phonics instruction should be systematic, which means it should be built into the term plan, and it should allow for plenty of revision and recycling to allow students to really become familiar with the concept or even overlearn the concept before moving on. MSL, as I've mentioned before, means multisensory structured learning. I've included a little photo of a child using scissors and glue and crayons. Of course, we can use these kinds of activities with our adult learners as well, or we can adapt some of these ideas to make them more appropriate for adult learners. The key take-home here is that when we are planning our lessons and when we're teaching, we should try to appeal to the different learning styles like visual, oral, kinesthetic, and tactile learning styles, and ensure that we have a balanced variety of activities. If we can plan our reading and spelling lessons to incorporate these different styles, it's going to really help the learners to understand the concepts. And some of the materials that we could use for multisensory structured learning include puzzles, songs, photos, videos, realia, and more. Okay, thanks so much for your attention. I hope that you got something out of this presentation today. And this has been quite a short presentation. If you refer to the handout notes, there's a lot more information and detail in there. And the handout notes also have a longer reference list where you can find more information should you wish to go off and learn more for yourself. I'd like to conclude by saying I am not a dyslexia expert by any means. I've only just started to learn about all this myself. One thing, however, that's very reassuring for me is that as I'm learning more about the adjustments to teaching that people should make, I realize that a lot of those recommendations I'm already doing and I have been doing for years as an English language teacher. But at the same time, I'm learning lots of new insights which I can put into practice in my own teaching to improve it and to make it better for learners with dyslexia. Thanks again for your attention. I hope this presentation will help you to improve your dyslexia-friendly practice.